Good evening, and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement team in the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at Chicago Public Library, welcome. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. I would like to thank the Chicago Public Library staff who worked to make this event possible, and we want to let you know that books are available for purchase, and it will be right here after the program. And Governor Ryan will sign books at the conclusion of the program. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience and will collect the cards you received when you came in the door. Virtual viewers, please put your questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome former Illinois Governor George H. Ryan, along with experts and advocates Andrea Lyon and Rob Warden, to discuss his book, Until I Could Be Sure: How I Stopped the Death Penalty in Illinois. As governor of Illinois, George H. Ryan Sr. left an indelible mark on his state and country by leading a groundbreaking challenge to capital punishment, an effort that sparked a growing public outcry against the death penalty. In the 2 decades since Governor Ryan issued his historic statewide moratorium on the use of the death penalty in Illinois, 14 states have either banned or issued a moratorium against all criminal executions. Prior to his action, capital punishment was illegal in only 13 states. Governor Ryan built international support for his moratorium by focusing on a fundamental flaw in the use of the death penalty: the strong possibility that the criminal justice system would inadvertently convict and execute an innocent person. In addition to his groundbreaking leadership on the death penalty as governor, George Ryan led a forward-looking, efficient, and effective administration that stressed improvements in education, the quality of life in Illinois, and updates to the state's human and physical infrastructure. His biography, Until We Could Be Sure, was released in 2020. And is, of course, available at your Chicago Public Library branches. Andrea Lyon is a renowned lawyer, author, speaker, professor, and former dean of the Valparaiso University Law School, who has been featured on national news and media outlets. Dubbed the Angel of Death Row by the Chicago Tribune, she was the first woman to serve as lead attorney in a death penalty case, and she holds an unparalleled 19 wins in 19 capital cases. In January of 2015, Ms. Lyon was awarded Operation Push's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Lyndon B. Johnson Dreammakers Award. A winner of the prestigious National Legal Aid and Defender Association's Reginald Heber Smith Award for Best Advocate for the Poor in the Country, she is a nationally recognized expert in the field of death penalty defense. She is the author of a variety of articles and books, including The Angel of Death Row, also available at Chicago Public Library. Rob Warden is the Executive Director Emeritus and co-founder of the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law, and a founding director of the Innocent Network, an international affiliation of organizations providing pro bono legal services to convicted men and women with claims of actual innocence. During his 16-year tenure at Northwestern Law, ending in 2015, the CWC was instrumental in exonerating 31 wrongfully convicted men and women in Illinois. Before joining Northwestern, he was editor and publisher of the legal affair monthly Chicago Lawyer, where his investigations into wrongful convictions in Illinois capital cases launched a movement that culminated both in the founding of the CWC in 1999 and abolition of the Illinois death penalty in 2011. His reporting at Chicago Lawyer was instrumental in 13 exonerations, including that of Gary Dotson, the nation's first prisoner to be exonerated by DNA. He is the author of 7 books, the most recent being True Stories of False Confessions, also available at Chicago Public Library. In 2014, the Innocent Network presented him its first and to date only award for lifetime achievement. Now it is my pleasure, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Governor George Ryan, Andrea Lyon, and Rob Warden to the CPL stage.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I presume this is on and working. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with 2 people who I consider the great heroes of the anti-death penalty movement, not just in Illinois, but nationally. Without the efforts of the 2 people who I'm privileged to join today, we simply wouldn't be where we are. Today, the death penalty has been abolished by 23 of the 50 states, and we have gubernatorial imposed moratoria, such as the one Governor Ryan imposed in Illinois 20 years ago in California, which has the largest death row in the nation, Oregon and Pennsylvania. And if we add to these states that have abolished the death penalty, more than half of the remainder, that's the 23 states where capital punishment is supposedly being practiced, only half of those have had an execution in the last decade. So the death penalty is genuinely out of vogue. In 1972, as many people here probably are aware, the United States Supreme Court voided all state capital punishment statutes on the grounds that the death penalty was being applied in an arbitrary, capricious, wanton, and freakish manner. That didn't outlaw the death penalty. It simply said that it was being applied in an unconstitutional manner and therefore could not stand. So 36 states ultimately reinstated the death penalty, Illinois being one of them. Governor Ryan, who was in his fourth year in the legislature when it was established, when the Illinois law was enacted in 1977, had voted to reinstate it. And then in succeeding years, as a legislator, he had voted to expand the scope of the death penalty in significant regards. So he was not, in any sense, a congenital abolitionist, but he was a man with an open mind who was willing to listen to facts, and that's exactly what he did. Now, when we enacted the death penalty, in Illinois, in order ostensibly to reduce its propensity to be imposed in an arbitrary and capricious manner, the law narrowed the scope of capital punishment to 6 specific offenses: the murder of a police officer, a correctional officer, a firefighter, multiple murder, murder of a child, murder in the course of certain other felonies. And over the years, we increased the number of so-called aggravating factors that would make a case eligible for the death penalty from that initial 6 to 20, which is where it stood at the time when Governor Ryan was sworn in as governor in 1999. By 2000, 13 individuals who had been sentenced to death in Illinois had been exonerated on the basis of strong claims of actual innocence. In that same period, we had executed only 12, so we'd exonerated more people than we'd executed. And so in the year 2000, Governor Ryan, because of those 13 mistakes, imposed the nation's first moratorium on executions. It had never been done before. And then in the following 3 years before he left office, in January 2003, he commuted the sentences of everyone on death row. 8 years after that, when the legislature finally moved to eliminate the Illinois capital punishment statute, it turned out that we had 303 individuals who had been sentenced to death in this state, and of those, 21 had been exonerated. So we had an error rate in excess of 6%. Now, Governor Ryan's work not only led to the abolition of the death penalty in Illinois, but it was also instrumental in the abolition in New Mexico, New Hampshire, Maryland, and other states that followed, that preceded or followed Illinois. So Governor Ryan, I think, is, to me, the #1 hero of the anti-death penalty movement. And with that, I'd like to turn you over to my dear friend, Andrea Lyon.
That was very nice of you to say, Robin. If like half of it is true about me, I would be very happy. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Lyon, and I am a capital defense lawyer. I still do death penalty cases. I've got one in Ohio right now. I want to tell you a little bit about what I learned about the death penalty, and then how I came to have the honor of getting to know Governor George Ryan. As I said, or as you were told, I'm actually the first woman in the United States to ever defend a death penalty case, and I have won all of my death penalty hearings so far, primarily because I'm very good at begging. It's a very important skill, but also because it's really important to understand why people end up the way that they end up. And that if you listen and pay attention and try to figure that out, you can take a jury on the journey with you to understand the client and where things went wrong for him or her. When I left the public defender's office, I started what was called then the Death Penalty Resource Center, which was the agency that represented all the death row inmates in the state of Illinois in both state and federal court. And I had been there for maybe a year and a half, something like that, when John Wayne Gacy was about to be executed. You may or may not remember, was a serial killer of young boys and buried a bunch of them under his porch, I believe, in the suburbs. And that was not a case that belonged to the center because it predated the existence of the center. But because that execution was coming up, there was a symposium that was done about the death penalty at Kent Law School. And one of the speakers was Bill Kunkel, who was the prosecutor who prosecuted John Wayne Gacy and got the death sentence. And there was a state legislator, myself, and I forget who else. And at that point, we had been investigating all of these cases. When you're doing what's called collateral representation, what that means is that you're looking outside the record in the rest of the world to see if there are any constitutional violations in the defendant's case, the death row inmate's case, either having to do with sentence or having to do with guilt and innocence. And I expected, we had about 168 men on death row at that point, and I expected that maybe we'd find one wrongfully convicted person, because I thought the system did a better job than in fact it does. I thought if the defendant was convicted, sentenced to death, the Illinois Supreme Court had affirmed his conviction and his death sentence, maybe he didn't deserve the death penalty, maybe he shouldn't have been convicted of first-degree murder, but that they were getting the right guy at least. And to my horror, I discovered that was not true, that we were getting it wrong a lot. And so that night at the symposium, I said that, and I said that that somewhere between 5 and 10% of the people with affirmed death sentences were factually innocent of the crime, had nothing to do with the crime. And Kunkel interrupts me and says, "Oh, no, it's nowhere near as high as 5 or 10%. It's, 2% or so, and that," he said, "is an acceptable margin of error," if you can imagine. Now, I didn't swear at him, I thought about it, but I didn't. And I turned to him and I said, "That's because you know it will never be you or anyone you know because you are a white, privileged male. It's going to be my clients, my poor clients, my clients of color are the ones that these mistakes are going to be made and for whom there is an acceptable margin of error." Well, I have to tell you, this man right here, For this man right here, there is no acceptable margin of error. George Ryan actually thinks we should only convict people who are guilty. Shocking idea. And he came to this, I learned as I got to know him, in large part because he had been, before getting into politics, he had been a pharmacist. And he was like, I remember him saying to me one time, he said, Andrea, you know, if I got the wrong pills in the wrong bottles 50% of the time, they should take my license. How is this okay? And I said, well, it's not, Governor. And he did something brave, original, empathetic, and important. I haven't had a chance to say this to you publicly, Governor, but one of the great joys of my life is my friendship with you and the fact that I have been able to help you in whatever small way I've been able to help you. And it is my great honor to introduce to all of you former Governor and amazing person, George Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrea and Rob, for partaking here today and giving me a hand when I need it most. I want to thank the crowd that's here, and I certainly want to thank the staff here at the library. They've been very accommodating and helpful. When I went to Springfield in 1972 as a member of the Illinois House of Representatives, the death penalty was back on the agenda to be reinstated all across the nation. And it was one of my first votes in the Illinois House. And as I listened to the debate about whether the death penalty should be reinstated or not, there was a fellow, and maybe some of you remember who he was, Bob Mann was his name. He was an alderman first, I think, in the city of Chicago, and then came to Springfield. And he was an avid anti-death penalty guy, and got up on the floor of the House while the debate was going on, and said, for those of you that are voting green here today, how many of you would be willing to throw the switch to kill somebody? And I was an avid supporter of the death penalty at the time. I thought it was necessary to have to prevent crime, and believed all of those things until I got involved in it a little further. But Bob Mann asked that question, and it gave me a little time to kind of stop and think and say, you know, I think the death penalty is needed, but I don't want to throw the switch, and I don't know who would want to kill somebody. And so I voted for it because I thought it was necessary, and it passed, and it became law. I got elected governor a few years later, and I was sitting in the living room of the mansion in Springfield after 2 months of being in office with my wife, Laura Lynn, and I was watching the news in Chicago, and they're showing a little guy that had been put on death row and sat there for 16 years named Anthony Porter. And Anthony Porter had been released because somebody determined that after 16 years they finally decided that he wasn't guilty of the crime that he was convicted of, a drug deal that had gone bad in a park someplace on the south side in Chicago where 2 people were killed, and Anthony Porter took the rap. He didn't know really what he had done or why he was there. He was demented and had a pretty low IQ. But he was just a poor guy that had been around and done some things, but he wasn't a killer. And he was sat in prison for 16 years, only to be told that he was innocent and turned loose. And I turned to my wife and I said, how the hell does that happen in America? We put a guy in jail for 16 years and let him worry every day he wakes up. Is the day that I'm going to be executed? And I decided that was really, that there's no justice in that at all. And I got to looking into it, and I got interested in it. And I finally got involved probably more than I really wanted to at the time. But we came up with several things that we wanted to do. And I went to the General Assembly after I appointed a commission of 14 people to help look at the death penalty laws in Illinois, that we could make it more impossible to have to execute an innocent person. And we put together, that commission did, 85 recommended legislative changes to be passed by the Illinois General Assembly. It was an election year, and politicians get a little nervous about whether they're for crime or against crime, and they don't want to get labeled that they're for crime or against the police or whatever. And they didn't pass. Mike Madigan in the House of Representatives at the time was the Speaker. He passed a bill that required taping of confessions in capital cases and murder cases and death penalty cases. And that was the only bill out of the 85 they passed. It was an election year, and the political guys didn't want to touch it. The Senate buried it in a committee, and so I decided that I only had a short time left in office, and I had signed a confession or a conviction and a death sentence for one person while I was there. And it came before I got really too involved, but I was involved in the death penalty at the time. And his name was Andy Corkialis. He was a bad guy. There wasn't any question about it. He and his friends and his brothers would roam the streets of Chicago and pick up young women and do a lot of bad things to them and throw them back out on the streets, assuming they were dead. Well, they got caught, they got convicted, and they got sentenced to death. And I agonized over whether to sign that death warrant or not, because of the times that Rob spoke of about all of the errors that go on, and the whole death penalty laws are just flaunt with errors. They got a lot of errors and a lot of things in them that would make you believe that we shouldn't have a death penalty law. And I've often said that if we're going to kill somebody, we ought to have a perfect law. And I don't know how you ever get a perfect law to do that, so we shouldn't have the death penalty. And that's when I made the determination, after I signed the death warrant on Corkialis, that there would be no more executions as long as I was governor of Illinois, and I called for a moratorium on executions. And decided after that, and in the interim, later on, to commute the sentences of 167 men and women on death row here in Illinois. And we're here at that position now. And as Rob said, there's 27 states, I think, that still have the death penalty in the United States and the United States government. And I thought maybe if I wrote a book and told about what I knew and why I thought that we should have an abolition of the death penalty, to maybe hurry up the abolition of it with a book to educate people about why maybe we shouldn't have the death penalty. And that's why I'm here tonight, is just to talk about that and to help educate the public generally about why the death penalty is really just no good. I look back at the case with O.J. Simpson, when they had all of the problems with the passage of evidence, that the chain of evidence was broken and who did this, and they could have done it this way and that way. And now we're talking about putting somebody on death row with all the possibilities of error, and there's no way you're going to stop that. So there's no reason to really have the death penalty. I believe in my heart that I think that prison life for forever is a tough penalty in a room that's about 8 by 12, and you get out maybe once an hour a day to be outside of the cell. Now, you do that for the rest of your life. It's a tough penalty, and I think it's probably worse than death. And a lot of people think that the execution would be cheaper to have, and so why not just have it and get it over with, and you avoid all the expense? The problem with that is that when you become a prisoner and accused of death, you're immediately given special privileges, free lawyers, separate quarters. You get all kinds of privileges that the state pays for, and it's a thing that because they're on death row. And the other thing is that Anthony Porter sat in jail for 16 years, if you can imagine that. I'm going to tell you one story about a fellow up in the northwest part of the state. His name was Gary Gauger. And Gary was a fellow that lived with his mother and dad and his sister in a farm. They were farmers. They had a farm stand that they sold on the highway, and they also had a motorcycle shop in their farm businesses that they sold motorcycle parts. And Gary went home one night after he was a fellow that was kind of a hippie guy. He had a lot of whiskers and a mustache and some tattoos and long hair, and he was a big drinker, and he was a bachelor. He wasn't married. And he used to go out after work and get pretty well lit up and go home and go to bed and get up the next morning and do his farm work. Well, he went home one night and he couldn't find his parents. And he looked for his dad, and they found his dad with his throat slit. Looked a little farther, and they found his mother with her throat slit. Needless to say, the police came in, and they started to question him, and they questioned him, and they questioned him for hours. And they finally said, you know, if you didn't do this, if you thought somebody that did it, what would you think they do it, and how would they do it? And he told him some story that he knew or thought about and thought maybe that was going to help him get done, be released. Well, they convicted him and put him in jail for, I think, 7 years or something like that with Gary Gauger. They found out that Gary was innocent after an undercover FBI agent in Wisconsin or Iowa, I don't remember where that was, I think Wisconsin, was sitting around a fireside talking with all of his motorcycle buddies about the couple that got killed down there in Illinois with their throats slit, and they were laughing about it because there were two guys in the crowd that did the crime. They killed these people. And what I want to say is the authorities put him in jail and left him there for, I think he served about 8 or 10 years. And then they found out that there was an FBI agent in that crowd listening to all of this stuff that was going on with these guys killing these people. And of course, he got loose. It wasn't the system that saved him, it wasn't the government. And the other thing was, in the Anthony Porter case, it was students from Northwestern University that really found out what was going on with Anthony Porter and got him released. He was just hours away from being executed as an innocent man when he was given by the Supreme Court a stay so they could test his mental competence. And they found out that he didn't really know what was going on and really didn't belong and wasn't eligible really for the death penalty. And so you just, little things that you think maybe are okay, and the death penalty should do away with all the bad guys in the world. It's not that easy. And so I decided to write this book, and I had a lot of help doing it, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about it, and I got some good backup support for any questions that you may have for us. I want to thank you all for being here. Who's handling the questions?
I think Jennifer was. Did you have
I thought we had...
yeah, I think she was handling questions. There she is.
Anybody got a question? I guess we don't need anybody.
Let me ask you a question while we're waiting. So, you know, you often remind me that I am one of your two liberal friends. And
What did you say?
You often remind me that I'm one of your two liberal friends.
I was going to mention that.
And, you know, you're a Republican. You've always been a Republican. How did it feel for you with some of your colleagues, political colleagues, when you took this stand to do the moratorium? I mean, there was a lot of outcry against you. How did that feel?
Well, I was a little uncomfortable at first doing it. It was, I mean, everybody knows if you're a Republican, you were against, you were for the death penalty. And I was one of those guys. I believe I was one of those Republicans that believed it was necessary to have the death penalty on the books. until I got involved firsthand and saw how it really operated. I'm sure you all remember the police captain, Burge. There was a big part of my thought on this whole process. He would to torture people because they wanted to get a conviction and get a conviction out of somebody and sentence them so they could be killed to the death penalty. And it cost the city of Chicago millions of dollars. I think they're still paying for it, for the people that he tortured to get a phony confession out of. That helped me decide that we ought to have the abolition of the death penalty. But it was, I finally just kind of took it for granted as I talked myself into it to do what I did. But I had a lot of good support from people like you and Rob and a lot of other people, a lot of liberals and a few conservatives.
So I have some questions here from the audience. One of them is, it says, Governor Ryan, you were successful at building bipartisan support. How can we do that more on criminal justice issues? What advice can you give us?
Building bipartisan support?
Building bipartisan support, how can we do that more on justice issues?
Well, that's probably what's wrong with government today. When I went to Springfield, I was a Republican, but I got along with a lot of the Democrats, and we used to meet when we go to the House at the restaurant in Springfield the night before. Republicans and Democrats, we'd sit there, we'd go and have dinner at the same restaurant. We'd discuss legislation that we wanted to pass, and if Rob was a Democrat and I was a Republican, he'd say, I got a bill I need your help on, and I said, well, I got a bill I need your help on, and you can talk about it and get it done. Today, they don't even speak to each other. They're told not to, as a matter of fact, by their leaders. And I don't know how you can govern that way. I passed some legislation, and I always called, the first guy I called after I passed the major public works project that I had, a $13 or $15 billion program to reconstruct the state. The first guy I called was Rich Daley. And I said, Richie, I got this bill passed. What do you need for Chicago? We sat down and talked about it and worked it out and figured it out and passed what we needed to do for the city of Chicago. I might add the largest producer of revenue for the state of Illinois and the biggest city in the state. And there wasn't any reason to not work with its chief executive just because he was a Democrat. And I always got along with those people and worked with them. And I think I had more Democrat friends than I did Republicans on a lot of proposals. But that's the problem. I think one of the big problems with the government today, it's just all politics. It's too much politics.
One question you got from the audience is, what impact has making this historic decision had on your life, on your personal life?
What effect has it had, what?
On your personal life.
What, the death penalty?
Making the decision to...
Well, I want to tell you, I agonized for a long time when I was going to do the mass commutation of 167 people one day, and the next day I wasn't. And I anguished about it and thought about it and worked out and talked over with people that were involved with it, and finally made the decision after I had made a recommendation, as I said earlier, of 85 recommendations to make sure that an innocent person didn't get killed, and the General Assembly didn't pass but one bill. Had they passed that bill, I don't know whether I'd have done that or not. We could have maybe worked out a program that the death penalty would have been changed in some fashion to ensure that it wouldn't execute an innocent person. But they didn't do that, and it was politics, of course, again, because they were afraid it was an election year and they didn't want to look like they were soft on crime.
Another question you have from the audience is, what advice do you have for other states' governors on making the decision that you did?
Well, I sent a letter to the 27 state governors that have the death penalty. I got a call from the Catholic Archdiocese in San Diego about a year ago. And the 27 governors that they wanted me, that I was working with on my book and getting it out, and they wanted me to send a letter to each one of those governors, send a book to them, and put in a little stitch in the front of the book about why they ought to think about doing what I did to abolish the death penalty and to bring them aboard. And I think that that's what we got to do. It's like everything that you really do. You got to be educated and know what you're doing and understand it, and then just work with people on both sides of the aisle to get it done. And that's, I think, what I did.
Another question you have is, which I think you answered sort of, but why did you feel that the legislature failed to take action on those many recommendations?
Well, there wasn't any question what the reason was. It was like I said, it was a political call. They didn't want to. You probably remember Dawn Clark Netsch. Jim Edgar beat her because he made her look like she was soft on crime, and that was the reason I think he beat her in that election. That she was for the death penalty and those kinds of things, and Jim Edgar just beat her to death on it, and she lost. It was. I mean, that's what it was about. It was. I had Pate Phillip was the leader in the Senate, and Mike Madigan was the leader in the House. And of course, Madigan didn't. Madigan passed the one bill, as I said earlier, and that was to videotape confessions on death penalty cases. And the rest of the bills just died. And I left the General Assembly at that time, and I only had a couple of months left when I was doing that. But no, I think the political guys don't want to look like they're soft on crime to get elected. That's what that was about with her.
Another question from the audience is, what other actions should Illinois take to support those involved in the justice system, especially formerly incarcerated people?
Now you got to tell me that again. I didn't.
No problem. What other actions should the state of Illinois take to support those involved in the justice system, especially formerly incarcerated people, people that are out now but that were in jail?
Well, I think that if you've got an opinion about some issue that's in that field that you think can be helpful, you got to contact your elected officials, your representatives, and your senators, and I mean that's what this democracy is all about. The people that make the laws, and you got to work with them, and you ought to make contact with your alderman and your state representative and know them by first name and be able to call them and know them and give them your ideas and your thoughts. That's the only way you're going to get something passed. So you got to stay involved somewhat politically and help your candidate, your party, whichever party you belong to, and work with them and give them your thoughts. Help them get elected.
I've gone through the questions from the audience now. I didn't know if there was something else. Oh, yes, another one's coming. Sorry to make you run around. Okay. Oh, this one is for me and one is for you.
Hold that mic in.
Can you hear me now better?
No.
Okay. The question for you, Governor Ryan, is in your time as governor, what were you most proud of accomplishing?
Well, I don't know if I could call it pride. I mean, it was maybe satisfaction more than pride. I think the death penalty thing was my biggest achievement in my career as a member of the General Assembly and as governor. But I don't know. I did a lot of things. I had one of the largest public works project in the history of the state. My first year as governor, I think it was $12 or $15 billion, and worked that together and got it passed. I was pretty happy with that. Did a lot of things. We built a lot of bridges, and I don't know how many schools I built in Illinois. A lot of new schools and libraries, and it was a good program, and I was proud of that program very much.
Well, I'm going to read the question to myself, which is, Ms. Lyon, other than your ability to beg, What would you say contributed to your success defending death penalty cases, and any advice for public defenders trying those cases? You outwork the other side. That's the best thing that you can do. You just outwork the other side. Every motion that could be filed, I would file. Every investigation I could do, I would do. Everything I could learn about my client or about the mental illness that he might have, or about mental illness that ran in his family, I learned every single thing I possibly could so that I could try to figure out how to talk to people with whom I profoundly disagreed. That is, in jury selection, which people think, I could just go around and say, are you busy next week? Would you like to be on a jury? How about you in the yellow there? It's not how that works. It's a process of elimination. And one thing that keeps you from being on a jury in a death penalty case is if you oppose the death penalty. If anyone who opposes the death penalty is excused for cause, and that means that the people that you're speaking to that at least think the death penalty is appropriate some of the time, or they wouldn't be on the jury. And so what I had to learn to do was to understand why people felt like that, to stop judging them for feeling differently than I did, and to find the theme and the center of my client's life that would help them answer the question for themselves: do we have to punish him by killing him, or is punishing him with prison enough? That's the question that they have to answer. And there are a lot of universals in life. And one of the questions I would often ask jurors, because my clients generally would start to go wrong, I'm talking about guilty clients now, at about 12, 13, 14. Does anybody remember what their judgment was like when they were 12, 13, 14? Huh? I mean, all I wanted to be was cool, and I was definitely not that, okay? First of all, I was 6 feet tall at 14, so, sheesh. Anyway, your judgment's not very good, and if you don't have protective factors, you don't have a good family, you don't have a good society, you live around violence, you watch people die around you, all these kinds of things, it's very easy for someone to go off track. And if you talk to jurors about why it is they want to protect their own children from hanging out with the wrong people, they begin to understand what happens. And what I'm usually asking the jury to do is, because they've already convicted the client and they've already decided that he's going to prison, it's just a question of what is the appropriate punishment. And if I can get them to walk in his shoes just a little bit, to understand how that might feel just a little bit, most people's first reaction isn't to want to kill. And I try very hard to appeal to their better nature. And I believe in and have seen far too many times how people can be redeemed. I believe it. I see it. You are never only the worst thing you've ever done in your life. Never. So that's my answer.
We have a couple of questions that have been from our virtual viewers. So
Okay.
The first one is, can you speak to the role that faith and religion plays in this decision, and what should churches or people of faith do to support the abolition of the death penalty?
Did you understand the question, Governor?
What?
Did you understand the question?
No, couldn't hear it.
She asked, one of the virtual viewers wants to know, what role did your faith or religion play in the decision that you made, and what role do you think that people who are religious can play in making these kinds of decisions?
Well, no, look, if you're religious and you believe in a religious faith, I do. I call on my faith, and did it certainly when I was in the governor's office to make the right decision, and I did it on a daily basis. Sometimes I got a response, and most of the time I didn't, but I felt better doing it. It's one of those things that you really got nobody to go to, where to go or what to do, and if you're a believer, I know Abraham Lincoln once said he was driven to his knees many times because he didn't have any place else to go. And I think that's probably a pretty good way to do it. So I just decided that, I've been a Methodist all my life, and I go to church a little less than I did when I was younger, but I still believe, but it was a big part of it. You know, it's all, I guess, about the way you're raised and brought up and what your background is. But anybody that tells you that that it doesn't help hasn't tried it or doesn't know, but because it's there, and I relied on it a lot.
And we have one more question from online and then one more from in person. But the next online question is for Rob and Andrea. Can you tell us some other organizations where people could get involved with this fight?
Well, there's a national coalition to abolish the death penalty headquartered in Washington, D.C. There's also a wonderful organization called Witness to Innocence that's headquartered in Philadelphia and is headed by Kirk Bloodsworth, who was the first, he was on death row in Maryland, and he was the first person to be exonerated and released from death row based on DNA. These are both effective organizations. Sister Helen Prejean, the author of Dead Man Walking, was the founder of that organization. I had the pleasure of serving on the board for a while. That's a very effective organization, as is the National Coalition. So those are the two I would recommend, and maybe Andrea has others.
I mean, there's a lot of organizations that have that speak to these issues. One of them is Death Penalty Focus, which is, and there's the Death Penalty Information Center, which is an organization that simply gathers all of the stories and all of the data in one spot. So it's really very useful for when you're trying to talk to people about things like what the actual cost of a death penalty prosecution is, that kind of thing. There are social justice organizations, and one of them is Gamaliel, which is an organization that does grassroots organizing all over the country, faith-based, which I have the privilege of being on the board of, that is working to do criminal justice reform, and they have organizations they work with in, I think, 33 of the 50 states. That's another organization I would recommend, particularly if you have an interest in the more spiritual side of this. Again, I have this last question, is for each of the three of us, saying, what do each of us believe is the most effective means of facilitating criminal justice reform? An executive action like a moratorium, state law, legislative, or judicial, post-conviction, and appellate? And start with you, Rob.
I would, if you'd asked me this question prior to 2016, I would have said that specifically for abolishing the death penalty, the best hope would be the United States Supreme Court holding that it violated contemporary involving standards of decency. That was the basis for prohibiting the death penalty for juveniles, persons who committed their crimes before age 18, and for mentally handicapped persons. It was logical as the death penalty fell more and more into disrepute and lesser use, that would be the avenue. Unfortunately, I no longer believe that. I think now that we have to turn to the legislatures, and there's been some good news in that regard. Virginia, the first southern state, was once literally number 3 in terms of execution per capita, has abolished the death penalty. I think that that's a hopeful state. And there is now a constituency for the very first time for the wrongfully convicted, and to achieve reforms, such as here in Illinois, we have the electronic recording that Speaker Madigan got through. That's important. We have automatic access to DNA in those cases in every state in the Union. And there are a number of other reforms that were advanced by Governor Ryan's commission that have since been implemented in Illinois, and that's a good model for elsewhere in the nation, but I think it's going to have to be done legislatively at this point.
Governor Ryan, what do you think is the best way, through the state legislature, judicial?
Well, yeah, that's the system here in the United States of America, that the elected officials who make the laws and the rules, and they're elected by the people, and they should take their, and they do. Most people that are elected want to know what the public thinks, and if they want to know, they ask sometimes, and people should rely on them, and that's the system, and I think that's probably the best way to go. At least now on the death penalty. I don't know about other things, but it's one of those issues that probably a lot of people like me that really thought that it was necessary, and it was a crime stopper, and it helped to solve the situations, but it's not. And education about the issues are a big help. But legislative, I mean, that's what our system is about here in America. We elect everybody, and they're supposed to be listening to what we want and doing what they want, I guess.
So I'm going to end up talking about something I had not planned to talk about this evening, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think we need to ensconce in our government and the executive something that's never existed before, that I am chair of an alliance and have a book coming out about. We need a Defender General of the United States. We need to have somebody who can speak for the poor and the accused and the underserved at the policy table. We've never been there. Every single decision that has been a disaster from criminal justice perspective, like the 1994 crime bill. Who was at the table? Prosecutors and politicians. If Jennifer Linzer had been there, or if I'd been there, or Rob had been there, we would have told them exactly what the hell was going to happen, who was going to end up in jail, and what it was going to do to communities. But we weren't there because there is no place in our government for that kind of input, for that kind of oversight, and for training and all the kinds of things that need to happen for people representing the poor. I'm sorry, I'm going off a little bit here, but you'll just forgive me. There was a study that was done about misdemeanor cases representation by public defenders in Louisiana. And given how bad the caseload is, the average amount of time, including court, spent per misdemeanor is 7 minutes. Yeah, 7 minutes. When I was in the public defender's office and in a felony courtroom, I had between 200 and 225 felony clients myself at any given time. And that is still true. I worked a lot, I promise you. I worked a lot of weekends, I lost a boyfriend in the middle of it. He just like stop calling, you know, but you can't do everything when you have that many cases. So if we're serious about the constitutional right to effective assistance of counsel, which is in our Constitution, then we have to do something systemic. And the only way to do something systemic is to have someone at the table that's never been at the table before. Did you know that until Justice Ketanji Jackson was confirmed, that the last time we had someone on the United Supreme Court who ever represented an individual in a courtroom, in any capacity, was when Thurgood Marshall was there? For decades, there's been no one, and for decades before that, there was no one. all of the people that are making these big decisions about all of our lives have no experience of what it's like to be the little guy, to represent the little guy. So, yeah, that was probably more of a rant than you had in mind. Sorry about that.
But all right, well, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to especially thank our guests, former Governor George H. Ryan Sr., Rob Warden, and Andrea Lyon for being here.
Thank you.